Hello, my name is Laddick, and I'm the principal for e-learning advocacy at OpenLMS. The presentation you're about to watch is one part of our AI and Learning Summit. I encourage you to check out all of the talks in this series as we discuss the tools of today, the near and not so near future, and the challenges we need to address around these new technologies. Our expert for this session is Neil McGough. Neil is the Chief Product Officer for Learnosity, where he is building a long-term product vision across their entire product suite, including the Learnosity Assessment Engine and Question Mark, which is their certification, corporate learning and development, and compliance-centered assessment platform. Please join me as we welcome Neil on the main stage for his presentation about AI and assessments, paving the way for positive disruption. Hello, Neil. Welcome to the main stage here at the AI and Learning Summit. How are you today?
I'm doing good, thank you. And you?
I am well, thank you so much. Still, enamored by the beauty of technology that we're on different sides of the planet, but still talking in real time, which is fantastic. But I have your slides here ready to go. Are you ready to present?
Ready to go.
All right, great. Away we go. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd just like to say thank you all very much for tuning into my presentation today, entitled AI and Assessments, Paving the Way for Positive Disruption. I think the key word there is obviously positive. In a lot of cases, as column inches start getting written around AI, we're switching very quickly to looking at the negative impact versus the opportunity. And as we go through, I'd also like to reframe that a little bit as net positive. We can't possibly talk about the positive without acknowledging the potential issues and challenges. And how do we make informed decisions on how best to leverage new tools? So just to introduce myself quickly, I'm Neil McGough. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Learnosity. For those of you who haven't heard of us before, we're an assessment technology company headquartered in Ireland, global workforce customer base. Our focus is very much on providing assessment technology tools that advance the kind of education and learning space from kindergarten through to retirement. I kind of stress that a little bit. I think it's important to stress that the technology aspect of what we do here. Our focus is really to build and integrate best-in-class technology to allow others to deliver the best experience possible through assessment. Whether that's tools around creating better items or better test taker experiences, or creating better trust in results. And I think that's very relevant as we jump into the brave new AI connected world. I'd like to bring you through some of the experience that we've had directly, the viewpoint, some of the viewpoints we've formed over time on how to look at AI in the assessment world and how collectively we can be best placed to leverage those positives.
I want to, before you even get started, you just said something that I find really intriguing because you're the first person in the hundreds of interviews I've ever done. You said from, essentially from primary school through retirement. Is that a way, in terms of, helping lifelong learning, essentially, and other people are calling it lifelong learning, adult learning, those kind of, is that something that you've, is that phraseology something that you found effective? Is that just your turn of phrase?
Yeah, I think it's one to help try and obviously, we kind of end that as at retirement, but the reality is applicational learning doesn't stop at retirement either.
No, I was just saying, even after retirement, that would be the thing that would, brain health and those kinds of things are saying, you got to keep learning and keep curious, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it was a modernization maybe of our original K through grade kind of approach on it, but
another one, I love it. Yeah. All right. I don't want to get lost on it. I just thought that was intriguing. Just we so often hear, adult learning, lifelong learning, this kind of thing. But I like how it calls out that we have these different stages and we're going to have different needs and whatnot. But it's something that,
Yeah, and I think, I think just quickly on it, I think, our kind of base for education kind of ranges from K-12 through higher ed, through corporate L&D, through kind of through certification, through the and into kind of external educational kind of elements within that. So I think it helps us sometimes break it apart a little bit as well, because the challenges we face in K-12 here are very different from the corporate L&D challenges, especially as we look at AI and those kind of areas as well, obviously.
Fantastic. Take us away.
All right. So to kind of touch on just a couple of things we're going to bring you through. I think it's important to touch a little bit on the assessment journey so far, and the changes and the challenges we've had over the past measurable number of years in terms of how we address assessment. A little bit about how AI accelerates this or changes this. To walk through a piece on the opportunities and challenges in the space specific to our industry, and dive into some of the real world applications of this. Like, what is this starting to look like in people's hands? And also, what do we kind of expect to see come after that? And kind of what are our key takeaways and how people should view AI in assessment, and how do we adapt to those challenges? So I think, first of all, as I mentioned, it's very important to look at the assessment journey so far, right? We have quite often, I think people can look at the state of assessment as an incredibly stable thing and look at anything new as a major disruptor that is unwanted and unliked. But we've been moving quite strongly, in terms of how we assess learners and how we manage test takers kind of every day for decades at this stage. Assessment has shifted from a siloed, separated from learning approach to a much more integrated experience. The expectations of the ways we test in terms of the interaction types is continuously changing. Obviously, starting off very much strongly multiple choice where everybody began, to something much more interactive, higher fidelity, and a much closer proxy to the real skills we're testing. Even as recently as 3 years ago, we saw massive seismic shift in where we test people and on what devices, as COVID and lockdowns kind of forced us to adapt extremely quickly in that space. And we've already moved very clearly from a state that was kind of slower and more understood and stabler to something that is much more fluid and dynamic. So to put it in context, as we look at AI, is just another step on that journey as we keep kind of progressing forward the state of assessment, day on day, month on month, year on year. So let's talk a little bit about how AI directly changes this. First off, I think there's an interesting divide in approach now. There is the before and now. There's a clear distinction between how organizations were looking at AI pre-GPT release and post. Commoditization of AI, which is what the release of GPT has really done, has massively changed the ability for businesses to adopt this technology in a major way, whereas previously it was only the domain of the large or the extremely well-funded. Now, that's not to say, that there aren't deep use cases and deep investment in specific areas of AI that are obviously state-of-the-art above what's available to everybody else. But where, a new business starts today, where they can get to in terms of AI by tomorrow is a drastically different landscape to what it was 6 months ago. And I think we really need to look at that as, what I refer to as a singularity moment. It's a point in time that you can look at in hindsight and very clearly pinpoint the genesis of major change in that space. I think it's also important to note that the pace of change is drastically different from what it was before in terms of technological change and the mainstream impact of that. The cycles and the iterations have gotten shorter and shorter and shorter. As we look at, over hundreds of years, you have the steam train, the calculator, the PC, the iPhone, large language models in AI. The iterations. It's the age-old one. I did computer science for my degree years ago, and the one at the time was obviously Moore's law in terms of how quickly the exponential pace of increasing computing power. That's the same thing we're seeing in the speed of adoption for technological changes into the mainstream and into products and into people's hands.
Question for you there,
yeah.
And without hopefully stealing your thunder in any way, I think, because we're focused on the topic of assessments, that this is one of the key topics that causes educators, trainers, etc. around the world pause, mostly because they say, look, we've got to get assessment right. We've got to, and this is, either in high stakes moments or even, as we assess a learner along the way. And, with things changing so rapidly and whatnot, it's hard to keep up. And that's one of the reasons why they pull back on the reins and say, look, we need to be able to do this correctly. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. And, I think there's two elements to that. One is, the definition of what is right can be used as as a kind of an ivory tower in some scenarios, right? As something that is almost unachievable, and therefore we'll hit pause until we found the perfect way to achieve that. I think that's quite a flawed approach to it. What I would say is, using this technology, and we'll dive into it a little bit more later, doesn't mean using it wholesale in every application through it. It's about finding the areas of controlled intervention that provide real benefit. And that's the real key to being able to adapt to this, to be able to learn in a controlled environment, and continue to improve the quality of how we're using it in real world scenarios.
Super cool. All right, thanks.
So I think the other area that's quite fascinating, like the differentiator is different, right? When we talk about pre and post, kind of AI emergence at this scale, and obviously AI has been around for an extended period and is a large field, but specifically talking about the emergence of commoditized large language model tools in the GPT and the Bard kind of mold, it changes the differentiator for a lot of us who are building, either technology or assessment products in the market. We go from a world where using AI itself is a sufficient secret sauce for some companies. The use case might be quite standard, but they've managed to use AI to get some marginal gains, or maybe it's just a marketing buzzword in some cases, to a scenario where that's no longer sufficient enough to be unique or enough to be really valuable in changing how we do things. The application of AI and the use case for how you merge that into what you already do is really the key differentiator and the key valuable piece. And I think it's important to stress that it's what we do with it that really makes the difference. And finally, the last piece is the opportunity is emergent. We're literally not even through the first year of this change. I think one of the wonderful things of doing a recorded presentation at this point is that I will get the opportunity to look back at this at some stage and understand how completely wrong I was, and what time frame that was. I absolutely expect that we'll look back in 5 years at how we've used AI in the assessment process, and 50% of what we thought was going to be valuable won't actually have turned out to be valuable, because we will have discovered new or more interesting applications or more ethical applications of the tool in the in our industry. Also, think it's just interesting to bring in kind of some external quotes on this. This is one from Dr. David Carlos, professional of educational and assessment. Advances in AI are not necessarily the enemy. In fact, they should prompt long overdue consideration of assessment types and frequency. I think the key thing with this is, if you took out the first line of advances in AI, this could be a topic of conversation at any education and assessment conference for the last 10 years, right? We've been talking about the areas that we believe we should be changing and the areas we want to change for quite a long time. I think the key thing is this, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, acts as an effective catalyst. So let's talk about broad buckets of opportunities for AI and assessment. And these are very, very broad, and we can drill into them a little bit over time. But first off, the key thing is how do we improve the test taking experience, and how do we improve the outcomes for test takers, right? So first off, we can build better tests using technology appropriately. We already know that. AI adds an extra layer to that, right? Can we build fairer tests, more consistent tests, more consistent test experiences, all of those kind of things. But if we look, if we look further than that, look out over the horizon, I think the real meaningful thing that potentially comes from this down the line is not only can we test students better, but through that kind of application of the learning and assessment feedback loop and tools like AI within that, can we effectively improve student outcomes? Can we turn around and at the end of the day say more students are passing our assessment because more students are capable of passing our assessment? We know we've built a good test, the test that assesses the things that we want to, and simply we have built a feedback loop and a cycle that means that we have more skilled people. I think that's a huge piece at the core of any technological advancement, AI is no exception to that, is does it allow us to focus on higher higher skills and higher efforts by both removing the more painful ones, but also more painful pieces within that, but also bring the quality of our knowledge and our learning up higher. That allows us to do something truly meaningful. As you kind of noted, being a catalyst for changing how we assess and shifting that pace of change, as we touched on. We all know the journey the assessment's been on. We've historically been very reliant on standard methods of testing, very self-contained. We've known that we need to change those changes to reflect in tooling, and conceptually there's a lot of buy-in for that. But in terms of progress is historically slow. I think there's now even more of a challenge for that older system and that older model. One of the biggest ones we'll simply touch on coming up with this, and I'm sure there are numerous talks around the same area at this event, is sheer vulnerability to cheating and concerns around that, right? I think it's hugely important that rather than looking for the padlock to shut the open door, we need to look through that door and see what's on the other side, and look at how we take advantage of an external force to make us re-examine how we test and how we assess. How we harness modern tools to reduce bias, improve diversity and inclusion in assessments. This is one I include partly because a lot of the focus over the of presentations I've seen lately and discussions very validly is the concern around AI and bias, and drilling into that concern. It is an absolutely valid point, but it also misses the flip side of that, which is the potential. AI does have, we can build tools that are more effective at identifying, subconscious bias, socioeconomic, religious bias within test questions, in a way that the reality is the system is already to some extent flawed by the fact that there are humans involved in it, and that we all have subconscious bias in those areas, and to drive better quality as a result. So if we can build tooling that is better at analyzing test banks for identifying that type of content and flagging it to us for remediation, then we're in a much better. We're able to identify and remove that much quicker. And the fourth one, from my point of view, is always a fascinating one. Being in the assessment technology space is, one of the major thing is that this allows us to democratize quality assessment across the industry. And so, and tooling that would not have been accessible to the vast majority of companies in the assessment space just a few short months ago. Access to AI is commoditized. It's a base level piece of functionality that's accessible to all product builders, right? So let's harness that to allow smaller businesses to do more than they're ever capable of doing, in terms of high quality assessment, real formative learning, and building better feedback loops into their platform. I think it's very important that we view that as, a rising tide lifts all boats, rather than a siloed thing only possible by the larger businesses in our space. So we'll talk a little bit about the challenges, and again, I'm sure there are presentations focusing entirely in this area where that are diving incredibly deeply into them, and I think it'd be wrong to stand here espousing the opportunity of AI without addressing some of the real genuine concerns and challenges we need to tackle as AI becomes more commonplace. First off, just from an organizational point of view, data privacy and security, both for the individual and the organization. The reality is any emergent tech can and will be the Wild West for a period, and the potential damage there can be vast if not properly contained and managed. Ensuring that we're using trustworthy sources, content trained in appropriate ethical data, ensuring that we're using these products in a way that we know the flow of the data that coming from our test taker, from our authors and editors, and the clear ownership of that data or its use after that is hugely important. Now, there's obviously big kind of ongoing moves within the EU and within the US to decide where the appropriate line is in terms of in terms of, in terms of kind of government management of these things. But it's really, really important that there are some guidelines and clear guidelines and a clear understanding of what is ethical use of AI, to really be able to drive AI use forward from there. Legal concerns, I'm going to leave this almost as a one-liner, because again, I think you could do an entire presentation focused purely on this. The reality is the case law that will really matter surrounding AI and its use more broadly hasn't even been written yet, right? Probably won't be fully written for the next 15 years, and there'll be a huge amount of pain in between. It's going to be fascinating to see how that develops, and to see where lines from intellectual property, copyright, ownership, responsibility, all of those areas start to fall. Some of them are starting to clear up already now, but they're going to change over time. But I do think it's important to look at that and kind of realize that the absence of some of this can't be used as an excuse not to progress. It's more of a danger or concern to be aware of, and to manage and mitigate risk. Test fraud is obviously one that's been high priority. I don't think I've managed to get through a day without reading a test fraud related article, especially as exam season in the Northern Hemisphere gets closer, especially in UK and Ireland. The face of test fraud has changed, and we do have to adapt to that. We do know that a lot of our existing tools are still fit for purpose, or can be fit for purpose, provided we keep iterating with them, right? The test fraud landscape was never one that stood still anyway. And anybody who was in that space in terms of, online proctoring or secure browsers or other tools there was always having to keep up with the continuous invention of inventiveness of people looking to game the system. And I think that's just kind of a piece we need to keep on top of. I don't think anything's completely been blown out of the water through this, especially for more summative tests. But it is absolutely an area to keep monitoring and working through. And bias, as we noticed, the potential for bias based off training data is vast. If you take the foundation for the vast majority of models is fundamentally the internet. And if I turned around to you and said, it's going to be exactly as biased as the internet, I'm not sure any of us would be particularly happy with that. Again, I always remember the early days, in when I was in college, dealing with things like computer vision models. Computer vision models at that time, which were early elements of AI, were not good at identifying people of color. They were incredibly poor. That bias was baked into the algorithms that were used. So it's really important that we ensure that there's oversight and governance there to prevent this. It's massively necessary. At the same time, one of the best tools we potentially have to identify bias at a large scale is likely to be AI as well. So there's a strong balance there to be had. And the reality is, it's a somewhat large final point, but the unknown is the massive challenge within this. The reality is the space is highly emergent. 90% of the challenges we'll face with AI in assessments are absolutely unknown at this stage, and we can, being honest, we truly expect to be continuously blindsided by new uses or new concerns for realistically years to come. With that said, I think it's clear to call these out. These are challenges, not blockers. The worst thing I think we can do with an emergent technology like this is stick our head in the sand and refuse to engage, or close ourselves off from familiarity with it. It's inevitably going to impact our day-to-day lives, both work and personal, I think, as we've probably all seen to date. I'm sure I'm not the first one to receive a birthday wishes from a friend that was definitely written with ChatGPT. But the better we understand the challenges and the opportunities, the better we can channel its strength into areas of real benefit.
So I'd love to offer you the opportunity, given that you said, 30 days from now, this will probably, half of your presentation will be, wrong, or in 5 years from now, who knows? But do you have any opinions or what you think might be the logical outcome of things like the black box problem? Like, where does AI get its answers from? Or, are we just, are we going to have bias committees that will, need to go back and look at these models, or anything like that either you find to be like, we need to do this now, or anything like that?
I mean, I think the reality is, whatever approach we take there has to be digestible by the lowest common denominator in of users or people affected by AI, or else it largely ends up being quite ineffective, right? As in, we could set up bias committees to do this at a governmental level, or for instance at a the US and EU level, to do it. But by and large, while they might produce kind of very, very, very large reports, if it's not actually digestible to individuals, then it's not hugely different from a black box in the first place. I think we can work to set up, like, one of the things we looked at internally is how do we clearly state our own ethics as an organization in terms of how we want to use AI, more so than the originating part of it, the originating model for AI, because I think that might end up being more easily defined and more easily understood by a lot of people. It's like, okay, let's talk about it in the practical terms of application rather than necessarily the originating terms of the data to teach it.
Thank you very much.
All right, let's just talk a little bit about some of the real world applications that we've seen. And again, I think it's important to realize we're, as I said, we're I think 6 or 7 months at this stage into this cycle, and I would say there's a huge amount of people sitting in similar seats to myself who suddenly overnight had half a roadmap direction that they wanted to change, because there's so much opportunity here and trying to figure out what we can really do. I think the area we've identified, very clearly where we can see makes a huge difference is obviously assistive AI authoring. And I think it's important to note that, I think the need really centers around assistive, not in any way replacative. Focusing on use cases like, okay, creation of assessment content from key points given by an author, or upcycling of assessment content that already exists but might not be, may have been inherited by an organization rather than written by them, may need updating to match a style guide, may need generation of formative feedback, because it never had formative feedback written, and formative feedback tends to be one of the hardest things to go and add back in after the fact on those. Quite expensive for not a huge amount of gain in some cases. Quality of content assessment, being able to kind of set up and target what's my ideal view of quality. That could be things from related to style guides. That could be things related to bias. One of the areas we've looked at has been bias checks, on whether we do have things like, right, you click your check your quality button and you get a report back on, is it grammatically correct? Does it adhere to the writing style that's already been used in a few sample questions? Does it have certain things that may trigger as socioeconomic bias or other areas within that? High quality translation and localization is definitely another area that we've seen a lot of traction and we've been looking at. I think the localization aspect is quite interesting within it. A lot of other areas of translation to date have obviously been very, very dictionary based, but they may not get some of the distinctions or the localizations within it. Whereas in some cases with good prompting, you can really see some good results there. Item upskilling, being able to change and take certain items from different types. Obviously, the industry as a whole has looked at areas to get from multiple choice to other ways of testing. But quite often with large pre-existing banks, this is pretty arduous and might not make the top of the list in terms of ROI, depending on how manual that process needs to be. Areas where you can speed up that process and make that more of a review piece rather than a task-based piece for an author, is really valuable. And smart tagging of content. When we've seen this both at kind of authors within a publisher and an assessment program through to teacher created content, managing and maintaining really correct tagging of content for later reporting is difficult and complex, and inconsistencies creep in and that kind of thing as well. So what we're seeing quite clearly at the moment, is focus on areas that reduce friction, effort, kind of cost to produce items, and react like a value multiplier. Allow subject matter experts to focus on higher level tasks, and kind of treat it in a way that is single intervention, with a multiplier effect, because it's at the point of assessment creation, not at the point of student interaction. I think as well that there's a very good reason for focusing in areas like this. It's a very clearly defined area of functionality. It's early enough in the process with skilled content creators who can who can shepherd the process quite clearly. It's easy for especially for people like us in the assessment technology space to get information and feedback in relation to kind of efficacy and effectiveness. It makes it a whole lot easier for us to build good experience and iterate on it. It's also an area where I think trust in the quality and the efficacy of what's generated by AI is still very much in its infancy. It's something that needs to be tried and tested, and tinkered with and fed back on before it's anything that could be put directly in front of end users or test takers without intervention, whether that be content creation or something in real time with test takers. So really placing AI in that assistive role at the moment really helps us understand where that line sits.
What are you finding right now in your practice along that last point there? Something that fascinates me across all the conversations we're having here at the conference is so AI becoming the that trusted assistant that you always needed, right? As a subject matter expert, at what point do we foresee a future where it's like we're learning from the AI and we're basically bringing into that? Like, I'm trying to figure out the exact question I want to have, but are you seeing resistance from SMEs?
I don't not
to receiving feedback and even maybe, oh wow, I actually didn't think about that ChatGPT, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I don't think I think there's a next stage which is very much that the first stage is very much AI as assistant, right? They're sitting over your shoulder. There may be a foot back, and they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting for you. They're streamlining it. They're making it easier. But the content creator is ultimately the one in the hot seat. I think the next phase of that I think would be very interesting as well is that shift to, okay, they're sitting right at your shoulder. They're not necessarily an assistant. They're a colleague who's there to work through the process with you in that scenario. I know from our point of view, and I think from what I've seen elsewhere in the industry so far, everybody's starting with that kind of foot back approach, because the reality is we need to get feedback from real live users of these tools to understand what feels natural and what doesn't, and what adds real value. Kind of in a more uncontrolled manner. It's very easy for an LLM like GPT to turn around and start convincing you that red is blue because it's decided to hallucinate that red is blue. And if you give it a little bit too much power, it'll definitely try and sway your way of thinking that way. So keeping everything a little bit back and controlling it to begin with, to understand and part of it as well is to understand both from stakeholders and from authors what actually makes a difference. What are the time-consuming elements within that are valuable to have done this way versus the reality is they do need somebody who's kind of experienced in that space. The only other point I'd add there as well is one of the bits of feedback we've been getting from some of our customers in this is obviously, large language models are great at general knowledge, but general knowledge, even in general knowledge subjects, kind of in the K-12 space of that kind of thing, general knowledge isn't really the valuable part. Curriculum aligned general knowledge is really what's wanted, or general knowledge aligned to the learning material that the student would have been exposed to is kind of key. So there's a gap there in terms of what language, what LLMs know by default, and they need prompting and coaxing to be able to get that context in there.
Thanks.
I'll just bring in quickly just a kind of a couple of examples of the areas we're looking at and the way we're thinking about it. This is our so from a Learnosity point of view, one of our core products is our author site, where people log in to create assessment content for their programs. So one of the areas we're bringing this in is as an additional area. We're kind of kicking off a closed beta in the the coming weeks. Is around, again, that assistant, that kind of that side panel approach of like, how do you help me create content that is appropriate to the topic or the area that I want to cover? How do we tweak it to make sure it's including feedback? How do we prompt it a little bit in certain areas? How do we pass in context if that context is not going to be widely known? So we've kind of been focusing on how to build that into our end products. How to also test that out a little bit with other question types, and how to get the best piece out of it. Some are obviously easier than others. So drag and drop or kind of closed questions are quite simple in that respect. Comparatively, right now, any of the LLMs that are out there are not really great at math. That's going to change over time, but right now it's not an area. Our math question types are not an area we've gone near because it's a little bit too early to be able to show anything valuable. And similarly into areas like translation, localization, how do we make that a better quality, kind of less painful experience? Now, it's always going to be, I think, a starting off point for quite some time on these ones. It's a great seed piece for how do you get a chunk of the way in your translation programs, but there's still always going to be that element of like, right, how do you double check the efficacy of that? How do you ensure that program in German is as valid as your program in English? That's not where this is going to be day one, but it's going to be really interesting to monitor how close it can get over time. And then where do we see the waves of kind of the next couple of phases within this? So AI as part of fraud detection, I think is obviously a big area that's already taking taken off at a rate of knots. You can see the large majority of the kind of large kind of fraud detection companies have already started into the space in terms of AI detection. But I think really the big value is going to be in terms of detecting pieces of content written by AI. But I think one of the large valuable pieces of this is going to be the use of AI for looking at large data sets or certain behavior and being able to trigger anomalies. I think it's still hugely important that it's in the realm of triggering anomalies, not specifically identifying fraud. It needs to be in that assistive space again, because ultimately the impact in this area is huge for getting it wrong. And I think there still needs to be a manual process in there to ensure that we're reviewing that and we're tightening that up and ensuring that we don't hide a world of false positives. But it has huge potential to be more accurate than a lot of the ways that we're looking at to date, both in terms of reducing false positives and catching and also false negatives in that space as well. I think as we get more trust and insight into applications of these models, I think there's going to be a huge opportunity for providing real world insights into learner data and into test taker data. I think some of this will come from the authoring side of things and the applications there. If we can, and it definitely falls into the low intervention but high impact kind of areas. If we can ensure that the content we're building is tagged appropriately, and aligned appropriately, then we can really get a huge amount more out of the existing data pipelines that we have in place. But the follow-on from that will be, how do we use that most effectively to actually drive insight into potentially unstructured data? I think there's a big area there where that can help to move the needle in terms of outcomes, in terms of being able to point students and test takers towards areas of remediation, and how to do better next round, or how to learn from areas that they may have made mistakes. We specifically, and I think a lot of businesses have kind of shied a little bit away from grading in the early rounds of this. Obviously, again, in the same scenarios as fraud detection, the impact of getting it wrong can be huge. So as businesses dabble in this space, to begin with, it's a high risk, low value area potentially, but I think that's going to change over time as we kind of get more insight into it. I think there's a huge amount of areas around grading where you can improve the speed and consistency of tasks and parts of that are painful. And again, keep the grader and keep the teacher as the central part of the process, but really reduce the friction and kind of, and allow them to focus on the higher skilled parts of it. And again, what I kind of touched on earlier, I think when it comes to the feedback loop between assessment and learning, there's huge opportunity to really impact student outcomes by doing this really properly. And if you take the idea of AI-driven tutoring down the line, when we're more comfortable with models, what they can do and how to control them and shape them in the way that we need for these kind of purposes, that level of pseudo one-on-one tutoring just wouldn't be accessible for the large amount of test takers and students worldwide. But it can be through application of AI. And if we nail that, and if we manage to kind of get the right angle on how to do that in a safe and controlled way, I think that has massive potential for societal change.
I want to step back to bullet point number 3 there, because I think 3 and 4 really present what I think is a huge opportunity in the assessment world, which is, you've hit it, it's that painful task of assessment, right? I mean, I'm a professor. That's the last thing I want to do in my course. I love all the fun stuff of interaction and in classes, activities and this and that. But then when it comes to that, okay, now I've got to look at the papers. That's one of the promises of AI, right? Like, that is, being able to scale feedback, being able to scale that individual interaction. And as you've said, kind of put that in a fluid, in part of the, let's do this while the learning's happening. Wouldn't you agree that that's one of the huge holy grails of what's going on right now?
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's 2 pieces of that, right? One is, how do we use AI to be honest, to remove some of the inconsistency of what we do there, right?
Yeah, because paper number 35 I'm grading is going to get a lot less attention than paper number 1, right? Like,
exactly. You really hope your name is Aaron Aldous, so you're at the top of that pile rather than down the end. There's going to be a big difference in that. And if we can take some of that inconsistency out of it, to begin with, you've got a fairer system, right? Great. A fairer system is fantastic. The next piece then is, okay, well, how can you make that a better, fairer system? And I think that's the second round of it. And I think what we'll see with a lot of this will be waves of advancement in that kind of piece, right? It's like, okay, first of all, how do we standardize? And then second of all, how do we improve?
Thank you. Awesome.
So just to touch on quickly, what are we looking at? As I said, we're kind of focused very much to begin with on the authoring assistive elements of it. But I'll touch on this on the next slide. Kind of what I think everybody needs to take away from this is understand where you want to start with AI and where it can add relatively immediate value to your customers or test takers or kind of anybody within that space who matters to you, the stakeholders, and focus on that to begin with, but ensure that you're looking kind of forward from there, because things will change will change drastically. I think the way we've kind of phrased it internally, kind of as our own mantra, is the future is uncertain, revel in it. AI and its use cases that will genuinely impact, as I said repeatedly throughout this, still massively emergent. The goal of the aim of the game is adapt and thrive over the coming months and years within this. Our ability to judge where opportunity and risk lies on an ongoing basis really makes the difference in terms of where we succeed. The quote on the bottom right there is from a Boston Globe article about a study focusing on how businesses were able to effectively capitalize on the expansion of the EU into Eastern Europe. They studied a lot of work evaluating and surveying businesses in Germany at the time, and trying to get a read on whether they thought for them that these changes would be very positive, very negative, or quite uncertain. And when they went back, I think over the space of about 10 years or so, the reality is the businesses that succeeded were not necessarily the businesses in the clear positive group. The people who sat in the uncertainty group and were able to capitalize on it generally succeeded much more. So that concept of accepting the uncertainty within the future of AI and the future of AI in the assessment space, and continuous adaptation and rapid adaptation to it over the coming years, to us, is absolutely key to succeed. So,
damn, yeah, take us home.
So yeah, look, just to close out, I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in for this for your time today. Thank you very much for the great moderation and questions. I really appreciate it. And it's great to be able to bring you through where we see the positive disruption in our industry, and share a little insight on where we can see immediate improvements and things that add value in the industry. So look, I'd also like to say, anybody who's watching, who feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn or any other method. I'm always happy to answer any questions or any thoughts anyone might have.
Thank you so much, Neil. This has been such an insightful look at one really, really clear narrow part of learning as it is. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to put it together. I honestly, the reason I hopped on later is I was actually taking the note of you talking about accepting uncertainty. I personally cannot agree with that more, that becoming comfortable with living in that space where, okay, this might be okay, and not at least upping your risk tolerance a few more degrees, right? Where you're okay, we'll try this, let's test it, and then let's see how it works, and iterate from there. It just has to be a core skill for essentially everyone in the world now, but especially anyone in the learning space right now, as we grow into what this next future looks like. So I really appreciate you kind of ending on that thought.
Yeah, and I think it's a funny one. It's not necessarily an area where learning science and psychometrics lives happily quite often.
No.
But it definitely is one of those ones we need to figure out how to take controlled risks, and really be able to weigh up that balance of the potential benefit, and to be able to experiment in certain ways, because that's the way we get ahead.
Absolutely. On that note, I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to do this. People will reach out to you on LinkedIn, as you said, or through Learnosity, etc. But thank you so much.
Thank you.